Good morning. My name is Brian Wheeler, Director of Communications for the City of Charlottesville. Welcome to our new program, Cville360, a show to inform and engage the Charlottesville community. During the coronavirus pandemic, the city's leadership knows you want to hear from us frequently about our actions. We also want to hear from you and provide opportunities for engagement. We've launched this program on our streaming sites, Comcast Channel 10, and on a companion Zoom webinar, so you can tune in live and on demand while practicing social distancing. The webinar allows you to join the broadcast and ask questions of our guest. If you want to try the webinar, visit charlottesville.org/Zoom for the registration information. Today's topic is the city's current response to the coronavirus, COVID-19. My first two guests will focus on public safety and public health. We will have in studio the city's Fire Chief, Andrew Baxter, and via webinar, Kathryn Goodman, the Public Information Officer for the Thomas Jefferson Health District. The second half of the show will focus on the city's response to our most vulnerable populations and on the grassroots efforts of neighbors and nonprofits. We will have Kaki, Dimock, our Director of Human Services, and City Councilor Heather Hill. Whether you are the media or a community member, you can type your questions in the Q&A module of the webinar, or you can click the raise your hand icon and I will bring you onto the program to speak directly to our guest. Well, let's check in with our guest. And we have everyone here. Let me just check in first with Kathryn Goodman and make sure that she can hear us and we can hear her. Kathryn?
I can. We're all set.
All right, great. We're going to let our other speakers relax a little bit before we start. But we'll start with Chief Baxter and Kathryn Goodman. So Chief, maybe you could start us off and tell us what the current state of the community's response is to the coronavirus.
Sure. So at the local level, more than 2 weeks ago, we stood up the city's COVID-19 incident management team. And we've established a set of 4 primary strategic goals, which really have not changed throughout our operational periods. Our goals are to provide essential services to our community, protect and support our vulnerable populations, which include our first responders and any other city employee or anyone in the community that's helping to provide those essential services, protecting and supporting our workforce, including our volunteer partners with the Charlottesville Rescue Squad, and protecting and sustaining our healthcare system. So the overall objective there, and I'm sure people are familiar with this term now and always will be, but is to flatten that curve. So what we're doing fits into the bigger regional picture and ultimately fits into the bigger national picture too.
Chief Baxter, you and Police Chief Brackney sent a letter last week to the governor calling for a stay-at-home order. And yesterday, Governor Northam issued Executive Order 55. Is that what Charlottesville was seeking, and why is that important?
It's interesting. I think at the states across the country are asking the federal government to do more. Localities are asking states to do more, and our communities are asking us as localities to do more. So our intent there was to leverage the authority of the state to help us at the local level in getting people to do what we know really is the only effective mitigation strategy at this point, which is reducing human-to-human contact and social distancing, so we, again, can stay under that hospital capacity curve and lengthen out over time the number of cases of COVID-19.
And the governor yesterday in his remarks mentioned he was shocked to see the activity at the beach, Virginia Beach, which he made sure to close then through his order. Right. But locally here, what have been the areas of concern?
So we had some concerns last week with parks and took some additional steps to indicate to people in the community that while we encourage people to get outside and exercise and get fresh air, and that's an important stress reliever, I think, for all of us. But what we were seeing was people congregating in groups larger than 10 and that were not maintaining that appropriate level of social distancing. We had some challenges at the skate park as well. And I don't think there's anybody in a leadership position in the city that didn't understand and empathize with people's desire to connect and to be social. We're social beings. But the prism through which we are looking at every issue now is through a public health and public safety prism. So the governor's order yesterday, Executive Order 55, certainly brought us closer to where we think we need to be in terms of encouraging and ultimately gaining compliance and ultimately enforcing social distancing.
Let's bring Kathryn Goodman on. Ms. Goodman, you've been on the front lines of the community's response from the beginning. Tell us what role the Health District is playing right now.
That's a great question. So our role with the Health District, so we cover Charlottesville and also the surrounding 5 counties, so Albemarle, Fluvanna, Louisa, and Nelson, and Greene. And our big role here is to help with all of the pandemic response efforts. So we're underneath the Virginia Department of Health, and we are doing the contact investigations for any positive cases. We are monitoring the status of where our case numbers currently stand and providing the resources needed for emergency personnel to be able to help with these responses.
And is there anything you can tell us today about where we are with the case numbers?
As of this morning, we have 61 cases in the district. Of those 61, 6 of them are what we consider to be clinically diagnosed. So these are individuals that are really close contacts with someone who was lab positive. So we have 55 lab confirmed COVID-19 cases in our health district, and then an additional 6 that are clinically diagnosed. So most of those would be, for example, a spouse, someone who is showing symptoms, but we aren't testing them because they live so closely with someone who was tested positive.
And tell us about the COVID-19 hotline. We'll put up that number in a second, but it's 434-972-6261. How can the community take advantage of that resource?
The hotline is available Monday through Fridays from 8 to 4:30. We know there's a lot of questions. It's a really difficult time right now, especially with asking people to stay home. And so our hotline is available for anyone who has any questions. So we can help give you resources for daycare, food, financial support. We'll direct you to the right resources in the community. And we can also answer all of your general questions about COVID-19. So if you're concerned that you may have been exposed, we'll talk to you about that. If you think you need to be tested, we can help connect you with the right place that can test you.
Great. Thank you, Kathryn.
Yep.
Chief, what are some of the key challenges ahead for local government at this point?
I think PPE remains a challenge. We are tracking that on a daily basis, and not just for folks that you might think of, obviously our first responders, but we have other city employees that are, for example, cleaning facilities, or and we need to make sure that they have the proper guidance in terms of PPE and decontamination and cleaning procedures and decontamination procedures, and we're following CDC guidance there. And but we have not at this point received clear information about when we might expect PPE shipments to arrive, and that again is something that's a question on people's minds in our business across the country and around the world. So that's obviously a major concern. Some other things that we're really focused on in this operational period are making sure that we're supporting our skilled care facilities. People may be aware of some challenges that they've had and some difficult situations that have occurred in the Metro Richmond area. We're on a conference call with our colleagues from that part of the state once a week, so we can learn what strategies worked for them and what didn't, and we're trying to adjust our response and support those facilities in any way that we can, because as people would understand, that's a very, very high risk group, and an outbreak in a facility like that could easily overwhelm the EMS system and have a significant impact on the healthcare system more broadly. So we're also working in concert with our partners to think about and support additional hospital capacity. That's obviously driven by the health system, but we play a role there in making sure that our EMS system is connected in an appropriate way if that comes to pass. We'll be talking with the National Guard this week about what capacity they might be able to bring to bear locally, particularly in terms of planning and logistics. And then also looking at some other ways that we might support our Regional Emergency Operations Center as it expands.
Great. as people watch the news and they're looking at New York and the hospital issues there, we're not seeing anything like that here locally at this point.
No, we're not. But I refer to it as productive paranoia. It's our job to be prepared for worst case scenarios, and that at every step along the way, do what we can to mitigate any of those potentialities, and that's what's keeping us, moving at warp speed every day in terms of our planning and logistics. If you wait until a situation like that develops, it's too late, and then you're reacting instead of responding. So, I will say though that people around the country have been very willing to share their lessons learned. For example, the fire and EMS community in Kirkland, Washington, during the worst of their outbreak, they were pushing out lessons learned from their experience literally within 24 hours. And that's been very informative for us in how we shape our planning.
Great. I'm going to bring Kathryn Goodman back. Kathryn, we've got a question, and for those of you watching via the webinar, you can click on the raise your hand icon if you want to join the conversation. You can also type a question if you want me to ask it in the Q&A module. Kathryn, we had a question about the turnaround time to calls to the Covet Hotline. And before you answer, I want to point out there are two different numbers. One is a community resource line, the other is a COVID-19 hotline. But what can you tell the audience about turnaround time and expectations about whether somebody can take that call?
That's a great question. So we have staff, multiple people, at least 4 people who are staffing the hotline all day. And we have it set up so that if someone's on the phone, it'll ring to the next line. So hopefully people will get quick answers and quick information. If someone doesn't get through to us, they can just give us a call back in a few minutes later and we'll make sure to answer their call then. At this point, we had voicemail set up and we've changed it now so that there is no voice message because we've had the ability to answer all the calls. And surprisingly, in the last week, we've had actually a pretty big decrease in our call volume. So it's definitely open for anyone to call right now. And as we look forward and see how the call volume is looking, we may look at expanding the hours and potentially setting the voicemail back up so that people can leave messages. And if that's the case, we'll make sure to get back to you within 24 hours.
So Mark Covet asked a question about that voicemail, and it sounds like, Mark, you should try to call that number again, and somebody will pick it up today. So I think that would be the best advice there. And then Alex Worth has a question. What's being done to secure more tests and make them available to the general public?
Great question. I know there's been a lot of concern about tests. So the state Virginia Department of Health is working both locally with different labs in the area and also nationally with the CDC to make sure that there are more lab kits available. The health department here is working closely with both the hospital systems and also other private care providers in the area to make sure that we have enough tests available. It is definitely a concern right now as we see a large increase in the number of people who need to be tested. We're going to start testing more, but we're fortunate that a large university here like UVA has set up their own testing capabilities, and we're working to continue to partner with other agencies to hope that they can start testing more as well.
Thank you. And Kathryn, is there any current guidance from the Virginia Department of Health that you want to share at this point?
I guess the big thing folks should know is that the health department's doing all of the thorough contact investigations. So at this point, there's kind of 2 parts here. The only people who really need to be tested are those who are symptomatic. So people who are experiencing shortness of breath, fever, the different symptoms of COVID-19, and they have some sort of level of exposure. And then once someone is tested, the health department does a thorough investigation. So if they become positive, we will conduct this investigation again to see where they were in the last 14 days, who they may have had contact with, and then we will reach out to all of those individuals to make sure that they know that they may have been exposed and to ensure that they can get testing very quickly if they're showing symptoms, or to give them the proper guidance on potentially quarantine for 14 days.
Great, thank you. Chief Baxter, this has really changed how we do business, just our day-to-day activities. Since we don't have another question right now, let me just ask you to just maybe share what is different about your typical day today versus a month ago.
Well, I think the most obvious thing is for me in sort of my daily activities is one of the things I love about being a fire chief in a small city with 3 fire stations is the ability to go in and out of our fire stations pretty much on a daily basis and really stay connected with our firefighters, and that gives me a lot of energy, and it's a great way to connect with the folks that are out there actually doing the job. Still, I remember those days, but it's nice to be reminded in a very personal way. But when you go to our fire stations now, they're closed to the public. Obviously, if people have an emergency, we'll help them. But and we have signs posted on the door to that effect. And when you walk in, we take our temperature and record that in a log. So I don't think I would have imagined that as part of my daily routine even 2 months ago. Mm-hmm. But I will say the morale of our firefighters and paramedics is just phenomenal. They're very flexible and they've adapted very well. We have a very strong family culture. So there's anxiety and there's stress, but I'm just exceptionally proud of how they've responded to this.
We had a question come in about home donations of DIY kind of mask and face screens. Is that something we're receiving as a community right now?
So the Emergency Operations Center Emergency Support Function 17 is volunteer and donation management. So I would direct folks there to the Emergency Operations Center, and I don't have the number right off the top of my head, but we can certainly provide that. One of the challenges with DIY personal protective equipment is, in a perfect world, we would not use that at all. Our concern is that people would be overconfident because they're wearing some sort of PPE, and they might put themselves at greater risk. And again, the primary way to manage that risk is to maintain that distance of at least 6 feet from other people.
And later in the show, when we talk with Kaki, Dimock, and Heather Hill, mm-hmm. we will talk about the Support Cville site, and that's another way people can donate things. And
right.
we'll hear from them what's the most appropriate way to go about that. If you're just joining us, today on the show we have Chief Baxter, the fire chief for the city of Charlottesville, and we also have Kathryn Goodman, who's the public information officer for the Thomas Jefferson Health District. The second half of the show we'll be talking with Kaki Dimock, the city's director of human services, and Heather Hill, a member of Charlottesville City Council. We give out one last call for questions for our first two guests here, and I'll bring back Kathryn Goodman. Kathryn, is there anything you want to add at this point?
I think it's important people know that we are really working around the clock on this pandemic. So public health has been preparing for years and decades, quite frankly, to respond to a pandemic. We didn't think it was going to happen, and unfortunately it's here. And so, our local health departments are here for you. We know it's a really difficult time, but we're trying to make sure that we're able to respond to all of the questions and concerns as quickly as possible, and also while doing a thorough investigation to make sure that we can help prevent the spread any further in the community.
And Kathryn, somebody's asked a question. If somebody thinks they need a test, what do they do? Where do they go?
Great question. So that's actually a lot of questions we've received lately are about testing. So number one is that if someone thinks they need to be tested, they should call their primary care provider right away. If their primary care provider is not offering testing, they can call the health department and we can connect them with clinics in the area that are offering testing. And if they're really concerned, and of course, if they have symptoms that are somewhat of an emergency, then they should go to the emergency department.
Kathryn, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate the information. You're welcome to stay on if you want to linger in case somebody else has another question for you. But if you need to get to your duties at the Emergency Operations Center, we certainly understand.
Thank you.
All right. Chief Baxter, we're going to now invite Heather Hill and Kaki Dimock to join us. Thank you for staying with us.
Absolutely.
Because I imagine some other questions may come up for you. So let's bring on first Kaki Dimock. And Kaki, can you hear us?
I can. Can you hear me?
We can. Thank you.
Excellent.
Thank you for joining us. Kaki is the city's Director of Human Services. And we want to talk about the most vulnerable populations and the grassroots efforts of our neighbors and nonprofits. First, maybe you can tell us what are the most vulnerable populations that need our attention right now?
Well, normally in a sort of traditional kind of crisis, we might consider the vulnerable populations of concern to be people who are experiencing homelessness or people who are experiencing significant financial need. And we would frequently include people who are isolated or elderly in that mix. I think this particular challenge is different because we include public safety and healthcare personnel as members of that vulnerable population. It's critically important, even as we take steps to flatten the curve, that we do all we can to protect our public safety and healthcare personnel so that they can continue to work with people who are gravely ill over the next 6 or 7 months. And so we need to take steps to make sure that they are protected and safe and healthy as possible. So that is a slightly different challenge for those of us who do this kind of work all the time. So we're working diligently to identify housing, food, mental health supports, and other kinds of supports to all members of this particularly large, vulnerable population group at the moment.
And we've got a question that's just come in for you. Are there any community initiatives that have been formed to help our vulnerable populations learn about and apply for unemployment?
Well, there certainly have been lots of community responses, some of which have been sort of neighbor to neighbor, mutual aid, sort of informal kinds of supports, and ones that have been larger, more formal, sort of comprehensive. Certainly www.supportcville.com has emerged as a very effective and comprehensive tool, gathering lots of the most recent information and guidance for people and links for people to apply for assistance to neighbors. And that is entirely grassroots organization, which has been amazing for us. I will say that both the Departments of Social Services and the Department of Human Services are encouraging people to seek assistance from a distance. And so to the extent that you can make your applications for unemployment or for SNAP benefits or any other kind of service using electronic tools or virtual tools like the phone or online, you're going to be better off. The unemployment benefit line to make a new application is 1-866-832-2363, and that once you've sort of made your initial application, then I think all of the other supporting documentation is submitted actually online.
Thank you, Kaki. And we're going to put up on the screen now first the Covet Hotline. This is the number that Kathryn Goodman was talking about. That's 434-972-6261. And again, additional staff are on that line. They've taken the voicemail off so that hopefully they can answer all of those calls. But if you have a health-related question, need a resource on that front, that's the place to start. The next number that Kaki is talking about is our community resource line. That's 434-234-4490. Let's bring in City Councilor Heather Hill. And welcome, Councilor Hill. Can you hear us? Try that again. Can you hear us?
I can hear you.
Excellent. Now we can hear you. Ms. Hill, as a city councilor, you've got a unique vantage point on the city's response, but also one that might not be quite what the community expects of a city councilor. So I thought it might be interesting if you could describe how a member of city council operates in a community emergency.
Oh, wow. That's a loaded question, I guess. It's hard because I struggle with the fact that I have this formal role as counselor, but I still am an engaged citizen. And so recognizing that there are some lines that are drawn, but at the same time, wanting to kind of get all hands in to be another resource available to staff and to the community has been kind of a tricky balance, but I'm hopefully finding the right rhythm. As some of you know, like I was a neighborhood leader before being on council, and so leveraging that network has been very valuable in terms of just communicating with communities throughout the city. But at the same time, we're also dealing with all the demands that are coming from constituents and also just balancing all the other hands that are on deck right now. And so for me, it's just kind of just taking those different hats on and off on a daily basis, and also wearing the hat of a mom with 3 kids under 10 that are home for the next several months. So I've just been so inspired by how many different organized groups, whether it's grassroots or formal nonprofit organizations, as well as in partnership with our government organizations, are working together. I just see a lot of bridges being built, and it's just so important that we are addressing this as a community. And this is not something that the city of Charlottesville on its own can manage, and it's not something that any one organization on its own can manage, but it's really about us working collaboratively together. That's the only way that we're all going to get through this. And so I just encourage that ongoing communication to be happening between different resources that are out there, and how do we leverage each other's strengths to kind of press through as productively and effectively as possible.
Great. And you mentioned that you were a neighborhood leader before you joined City Council. And I know that early on in the coronavirus pandemic, you started receiving a lot of communications from other neighborhood leaders. So tell us a little bit about that grassroots response that led to the supportcville.com website.
Well, there is certainly a number of folks who kind of came to the table, and before I even like kind of inserted myself in the neighborhood side, that site was well underway by just wonderful community organizers who engaged with some technology providers in our community through Willow Tree, and actually set that platform up. And it's been one that we've been able to kind of leverage from here to just be a conduit for information to be shared. So an example with the neighborhoods, it was clear that some neighborhoods had set up forms where people could reach out to a neighborhood leader contact and identify if they're part of a vulnerable population. And we are also just seeing some efforts to kind of create written flyers that could be distributed. And so when those efforts started to evolve, it just made sense that let's try to take some steps to provide these tools to every neighborhood in the community through our neighborhood leader network that we have at the city, in addition to some less formal folks in the community who take that leadership position on. And so it's just been really great to see us, just looking at the strengths that each of us can bring to the table and working together to provide guidance and tools that others in the community can make their own. And so one of the more tangible examples was this flyer campaign that Jefferson developed a flyer, and then they made it a template form that we could then use for other communities, and then distribute it out to all neighborhood leaders so that they could then identify the contacts within their neighborhood that might be the best point of contact as we get into where we are now, which we were anticipating we might get to a point where people have to stay at home. And do they have someone that's in there or closer to home that they can reach out to if there is an immediate need? And then that can then get communicated back up through the leaders, and then ultimately to the city and our community partners to make sure that those most vulnerable folks in the community's needs are being met. And I just say that one of the benefits here is that neighbors helping neighbors and getting to know each other, obviously at a distance. But it's just been so inspiring to see how many neighborhoods just kind of like took that charge and ran with it, and got feet on the ground when we were able to be a little bit more mobile. And hopefully those infrastructure that was put in place will just provide that connection to our residents with someone within their own neighborhood, or a series of someone's. I guess the ultimate goal would be that we identify a point person in every street in the city that can kind of serve in that capacity, and we keep an eye on those most vulnerable populations.
Thank you, Ms. Hill. I want to bring Kaki Dimock back here to talk about the resource line that's been set up. There are multiple pools of money that I understand are available, and I thought, Ms. Dimock, if you could explain the difference between what resources are available.
Yeah, so the actually community resource hotline, which Ryan put the number up earlier, which is 434-234-4490, is answered, or somebody is returning phone calls Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. We have a number of people who are returning phone calls. If you don't get through, which is pretty likely given the volume, there's about 750 or more calls every day to this line. Please leave a message. Leave one message. Trust that we'll get back to you. We're hoping we'll get back to you in 48 hours. Or sooner. It doesn't actually help to leave more than one message. It sort of confuses the responders. So trust that we're going to get to you as soon as we possibly can. This is a hotline that serves as an access point for funds that have been raised by the Charlottesville Area Community Foundation, the United Way, Congregate Charlottesville, the City of Charlottesville, and Albemarle County. Each one of those pools of money have slightly different eligibility or slightly different terminal amounts attached to them. The goal here is to get financial resources into the hands of people who need it as quickly as possible. So we have, Ms. Hill was talking about sort of bridge building. This is the best of all kinds of partnerships in my mind, that all of these folks pooled their resources together, taking advantage of both staff time, expertise, fundraising, contact, social capital, to try to respond to the need as quickly as possible in the community.
Thank you. I want to bring Councilor Hill back because we have a question from the community, and it relates to forming a more centralized system for our neighborhood associations so that they can all be working on the same page with the same information. I know that's a question you've wrestled with and city staff have as well. And neighborhood associations do things different ways. They reach their community in different ways. Some like to do flyers, some like to do email, some do Nextdoor, some do Facebook. So they already are on different systems, but are there ways we can work better together, Councilor Hill?
Yeah, well, thank you for that question. Right now, it's something I've been thinking about over the last week, and over the weekend have used a couple folks as a user group to test out launching what we call a Slack workspace. And I was trying to make sure it was something that for folks who'd never used one before, and I'll be honest, I had not used one until last Friday. Someone helped me set it up, and 2 users have tested it of different age groups have tested it, people who are either less and more familiar with that. And I think it's going to serve as a great centralized location where we can share information that's not in an email form, but it's also, that's just for neighborhood leaders to communicate with each other and to share their ideas. And I anticipate that I'll be in the room and the workspace, but not in a way but more just to kind of help facilitate the conversations and make sure the information is coming from the city in a timely manner to those leaders. And so I hope to launch that this afternoon. I was just waiting for a couple more feedback sources on that. And from there, we'll just, I think, have that more centralized place. But as you mentioned, Brian, it's difficult because every neighborhood does want to do things differently. And we certainly don't want to dictate how they should be engaging with their communities. Because for some, it really is, their own just email distribution list with their neighbors. For some, it's walking out on their porches and talking to each other. So we just want to, look at ways that we can provide as much of a central place for us to be sharing information among the leaders themselves and let them to determine how they want to distribute that throughout their communities with the resources that they usually use.
Thank you. And we've got about 40 people watching via the webinar, and many more, I'm sure, on Facebook Live, on Twitter, and of course on Comcast Channel 10. If you want to join the webinar, it's not too late. You can go to charlottesville.org/Zoom and register and get a link to join us and ask a question. I want to thank some of the technical folks who are behind the scenes of this broadcast. Cville360. David Dillahunt is at the controls, and David's usually behind camera, but we want to make sure he gets a special shout out for his work. Joe Rice is also in the studio at a safe distance, right, Joe? And we're keeping him healthy, and but also Joe's working behind the scenes to make sure that everything is running smoothly here. And then Lasheen Parks on the communications staff has been splitting her time both with the regional response, working at the Emergency Operations Center, but also helping us with social media related to this program. So I want to make sure I thank them for all their efforts to get this show launched. Let me turn it over to Chief Baxter and see if there's anything you want to comment on based on some things you've heard.
Sure. Just some sort of general messages that we share internally with our workforce, but equally important for the community at large to understand sort of our situation status, as we would call it. It's clear, I don't think this is a surprise to anybody who's listening or watching, but we have not reached our peak. We're looking at multiple different models. VDH, there's a model from the University of Washington that's been updated very, very regularly based on very recent data, and you can pick your state and see how that curve plays out depending on what type of restrictions are in place in that community or that state. Again, just so everyone understands that life safety is our top priority, and we are, as I said on the previous episode that we did last week, we are thrilled Every time a community member or a community group or a neighborhood solves a problem on their own, that's terrific. Because what that does is it allows us to focus on those narrow wedges of risk that only we can address. So that's critically important. I don't think it will come as a surprise to hear me say, stay home. There are a lot of people in this community that you would expect and many that you might not expect that are taking great risk on behalf of vulnerable people in this community. So if nothing else but for them, please stay home. Please reach out to your vulnerable neighbors, family, friends, coworkers. To the degree that you can, stay connected. That is the most important behavioral health, mental health action that any of us can take, is to not be isolated. Stay connected. Be kind to each other. There are going to be peaks and valleys and peaks and troughs of stress as this plays out over the weeks and months. So we'll get through this as a community, but we need to be kind to each other while we're doing that.
Chief Baxter, the governor put June 10th as a end date for his current,
Yes.
Order. Did that surprise you?
I was pleased to see that. I think that helps us in terms of both from a community perspective and from a regional perspective, and then particularly those of us in public safety, having a planning horizon that's somewhat fixed, understanding that could change, really gives us a leg up in terms of how we strategize, particularly the logistical end of an operation as large and as complex and as high risk as what we're engaged in right now. And this is sort of a campaign, if you will, and campaign success always comes down to two things: leadership and logistics. And we're trying to provide both of those for this community. So having that, doing this 2 weeks at a time is really challenging for us from a planning perspective. And it was good to see that. But when we get closer to that point, again, we will be driven by the data and by the facts.
Chief, we've got a question about how the city might enforce social distancing. And I know that's a question for Chief Brackney and our police department, but is there anything you could share about what their approach is going to be?
Sure. I think it's clear from all the conversations that I've been a part of around that particular issue that the desire here is for compliance, for the obvious reasons that we've talked about a number of times today. And so I think the first step is please stop doing that. I'm happy to engage in those conversations as well and give some professional and personal perspective on why that's important. But there is potentially an enforcement angle. It's a Class 1 misdemeanor for violating that executive order. So I don't think there's a desire on anybody's part in our localities, government, in any regard, to have to get to that point where we have to take an enforcement action. I know they're working really hard with CPD and our Commonwealth's attorney and with our partner law enforcement agencies in the region to make sure that we're sort of aligned in terms of our approach to that. And I think that compliance first approach, that's a little bit a softer approach, but understanding that this is, they're placing other people's at risk by that behavior. And so we will, enforce that if need be.
I want to circle back to some of our other panelists and come back to City Councilor Hill. Ms. Hill, is there anything you want to add as we finish up the show here?
Yeah, I'm just unmuting myself. I just really want to reinforce the importance of us all to remember that every one of us are humans. And as much as we're all in our official capacities, we also are having our own personal stresses. That's everyone. And so as you engage with folks and as tensions seem to be rising, because this is a very stressful time, we all have to just remind ourselves, and that when this is all over, that we can go back to really truly connecting with each other physically. But right now we have to connect in other ways. And one of the biggest things, as Andrew was mentioning, was just we have to empower our community to support each other. And, I think that we've seen that in so many different ways that's been happening. And I think it's short-sighted to feel that the city should be big brothering our way through all this. No, we should be encouraging that kind of engagement among the community for the community to help the community. And we're part of that community. We're a major player in that, yes, but this is a partnership. This is not a top-down approach. And I just really felt it was important to emphasize that point.
Thank you. And I'll switch to Kaki Dimock. Kaki, any final comments you want to give or resources to share?
Yes, I think in keeping with Chief Baxter and Ms. Hill's comments about sort of mutual aid and mutual support, I think it's really important that we use our superpowers for good, particularly during this time. And that there are lots of opportunities for you to connect. There's informal ways by connecting through Nextdoor or the flyers that were maybe put on your door, checking in on your neighbors. There's also opportunities to both receive support and give support at www.supportcville.com, and you can click on Give Support. And then there's an opportunity as well to sign up to be a volunteer or to look at volunteer opportunities for organizations that are serving our most vulnerable populations in town through www.cvillevolunteer.org. As always, while you're using your superpowers for good, please make sure you're taking steps to protect yourself, wearing gloves, staying a reasonable distance away from people, because we want you to be able to continue to use your powers for a long time.
Thank you, Kaki. And speaking of using superpowers for good, we're going to finish today's program with a special recognition. The coronavirus has upended many of our traditions that we do every day in our rituals. So whether it's birthdays, funerals, graduations, or retirements, you know, ordinarily we get together and have a group gathering on those occasions. So ordinarily, city staff would gather for a major retirement. We'd share photos, memories, and cake. And while we cannot be in the same room today, we want to thank Barbara Ronan for her 37 years of service to the city of Charlottesville. And I ask a few of her colleagues to share their best wishes for Barbara as she finishes her career in the city attorney's office.
Barbara, the City Attorney's Office in the City of Charlottesville can't thank you for 37 years of dedicated service. We appreciate all you've done, from real estates to ordinance amendments, and you will be missed by not only our office, but I believe most of the city staff, as well as our citizenry. Thank you for being a dedicated public servant, and we wish you nothing but the best in your retirement.
Congratulations, Barbara, you made it. The end of a long period of service to the city with much, much, much appreciation. Good luck with all your next steps. We'll miss you tons. Don't be a stranger. Bye.
Barbara, it is really unfortunate to offer you farewell wishes via video. I had really hoped for some cake and ice cream and maybe some stories or things like that. Unfortunately, that doesn't seem to be the case given these times. So I want to wish you the best in your next part of your life and your journey. I do hope that your cross-country trip will take place, even if it is delayed, and I hope you certainly enjoy it. I do want to say it's been a pleasure working with you for 15 years, a little more perhaps. You are the utmost professional, and we will absolutely miss you here at the City of Charlottesville. I wish you the very best. Farewell.
Hi Barbara, happy retirement. I'd really hope to celebrate with you in person, but I guess this video is gonna have to do for now. Wanted to wish you the best in your adventure to come, and look forward to catching up with you to celebrate at some point. Take care.
Barbara, I want to wish you a happy retirement, and after you finish your trip across country, come on back to Charlottesville and settle down. Remember all the good times we had, the jokes we had at City Hall. Good luck, young lady.
Thank you, Barbara, to your dedication to the city and to public service. We really appreciate it. Our next show will be on Thursday, April 2nd at 4 p.m. and we'll focus on the economic and business impacts of the coronavirus in Charlottesville. We'll be joined by Chris Engel, the city's Economic Development Director, and by City Councilor Lloyd Snook. We will also have back the city's Fire Chief, Andrew Baxter. He'll start appearing at the top of every show twice a week on Tuesdays and Thursdays to provide an update on the local response to the coronavirus pandemic. Please contact me with your feedback and ideas about future topics and guests. Thank you for watching, and please stay healthy.